So here we are, the final Wednesday service in Lent before Holy Week. So in our final teaching on the book of Job, and you're probably a little sick of this, but I promise quickly, just a review of where we've been over these 5 weeks. Job, as we've been saying, is one of the wisdom books, along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. If you remember, Proverbs' main point is just compensation. God gives you what you deserve. So do good and you'll be blessed. Do evil and be cursed. Ecclesiastes recognizes the randomness and chance in life and says that although you should live a moral and upright life, you cannot, by your behavior, control the outcome of your life. So stop trying. Live fully into each moment, because good or bad, it's a gift from God. So Job enters this conversation about how the world is run, which starts with that challenge, as we've heard, between Hasatan and God. Job, who is called blameless and upright, who fears God and flees from evil, has everything taken from him: lands, herds, servants, children, and even his health. And his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come to Job to comfort him and to help offer an explanation to his suffering. So we first heard the argument of Job's friends, which can be boiled down to this: God does run the world by just compensation, and God is just in God's wisdom, so they conclude Job must have done something to deserve his suffering. So Job should repent and seek God's wisdom in his life. The following week we heard Job's response, which basically comes down to, yes, God runs the world by just compensation, but Job insists over and over, I've done nothing to deserve my suffering, which we know to be true. So Job concludes God must not be just. God, who is a tyrant, who runs the world without wisdom, without justice. So then last week we heard from Elihu, a young man who up until that point had been quiet, waiting until chapter 32 to speak. And he's angry, as we heard. He's angry with Job's friends because they've essentially conceded to Job's point by no longer trying to persuade him to repent. And he's angry with Job because Job has refused to acknowledge God's wisdom in human suffering. Elihu insists that although Job may not have done anything immediate to deserve his suffering may be God's way of helping to safeguard him against future suffering, or future sin and wrongdoing. So Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu have all failed to understand the wisdom by which God has ordered the universe in creation. They fail to understand the place of suffering in God's cosmos. So tonight, God speaks to Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of the hail? What is the way to the place where light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Can you bind the chains of Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season, or can you guide the bear with its children? Do you know the ordinances of heaven? Can you establish their rule on the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, so that the flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings, so that they may go and say to you, here we are? Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of young lions? Do you know when the mountain goat gives birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will it spend the night at your crib? Can you tie it with the furrow with ropes? Or will it harrow the valleys after you? Do you give the horse its might? Do you clothe its neck with mane? Do you make it leap like the locust? Its majestic snorting is terrible. Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and spreads its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? God pauses and tells Job to respond, and instead, Job says he'll say no more. He actually takes both his hands and covers his mouth and says that even what God has said so far does not justify the suffering he's experienced. So God continues, deck yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger. And look on all who are proud and abase them. Look on all who are proud and bring them low. Tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then I will acknowledge to you that your own right hand can give you victory. Look at Behemoth, which I made just as I made you. It eats grass like an ox. Its strength is in its loins, and its power in the muscles of its belly. It makes its tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are knit together. Its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like bars of iron. It is the first of the great acts of God. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook or press down its tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it make many supplications to you? Will it speak soft words toward you? Will it make a covenant with you to be taken as your servant forever? Will you play with it as with a bird, or will you put a leash on it for your girls? On earth it has no equal, a creature without fear. It surveys everything that is lawfully. It is king over all that are proud. So along with the reading that I've been doing in 3 or 4 commentaries on the book of Job, I've also been listening to some podcasts, which, I mean, if that's something you like to do, I highly recommend. They're called The Bible Project. One is called Exploring My Strange Bible. The other is called The Bible for Normal People. And each of these podcasts has done some work on the book of Job and has really helped kind of build my understanding of what this book is about and what it is that God is saying in his response to Job. So to help us tonight, I want us to recall together a quintessential Disney movie from my childhood, Aladdin. Who knows the movie Aladdin? A little bit. So actually, Jessica and I happen to like the live action version that was remade a couple years ago better, but either movie works. But before we get to the movie, what is one hard and fast rule we teach all of our children? You do not steal. You don't ever take what isn't yours without first asking. And we teach our children, if you do steal, there will be consequences. There's punishment for stealing. Because you never, ever steal. Okay, back to Aladdin. Now, when we are first introduced to Aladdin in the movie, he's running through the streets of Agrabah, being chased by guards. And as he runs through the streets and through buildings and trying to escape, he sings this song called One Jump Ahead. Do we know this song? No. Some people, okay. One yes, one no from behind me. So listen to these lyrics. I'm not going to say the whole song, but these lyrics from that song. He sings, gotta keep one jump ahead of the breadline, one swing ahead of the sword. I steal only what I can't afford, and that's everything. And later he sings, gotta eat to live, gotta steal to eat. I'll tell you all about it when I've got the time. And if he repeats even later, again in the song, gotta eat to live, gotta steal to eat. And then he says, otherwise we'd get along to the guards. As the song comes to an end, we see Aladdin with his monkey Abu escape capture with a loaf of bread. And Aladdin tears the loaf of bread in half, and he gives half to the monkey on his shoulder. And as they come around the corner, Aladdin sees a mom with 2 hungry children sitting on the street with no place to live. Aladdin looks at them with compassion, and he hands over his half of the loaf of bread. And begrudgingly, Abu does the same. And the hungry children, now with food to fill their starving bellies, turn to their mom with excitement and begin eating. Now Maddie, our middle daughter, all of 3 years old, turns to me and says, "Hey, that's stealing. That's not right." And she launches into this song. So if we have confirmation kids and Sunday school kids here, they'll remember we learned it kind of the first week when we restarted Sunday school and confirmation up on the hill to the tune of Yankee Doodle. When learning about the commandment not to steal, we learned, Maddie sang this to me right after watching Aladdin do that. "Honest, honest, I will be, truthful and sincere. I will always tell the truth and never cheat or steal." So how do you explain to Maddie and others like her why Aladdin stole and fed those hungry children, but also maintain her firm commitment to the rule, you do not steal? So who's familiar with the prefrontal cortex of the human brain? It's the part of the human brain that sits basically right behind your forehead. And it's a part of your brain that we use for higher level reasoning. Things like problem solving complex situations, abstract thought, using correct behavior in social situations, self-regulation, assessment of risk. And so what if I told you that this area of the human brain we now know isn't fully developed until somewhere around the age of 25? It explains why teenagers are often reckless in risky behavior. They actually lack the ability to assess risk involved in behaviors and how to problem solve when they get themselves into complex situations. So knowing this, it's nearly impossible to explain to a child why it may be okay for Aladdin to steal the bread to give it to the hungry children, while also insisting you must never steal. Okay, with me so far? So what if instead we did this? Instead of trying to explain that, we take that child, our grandchild, our niece, our nephew, and we take them into our lap and we start telling stories. We tell them stories about their great-great-great-grandfather who immigrated to this country. We tell them about the history of the family farm. We tell them about our childhood and what it was like growing up. We tell them about when we learned to ride a bike, about our elementary school friends, about catching our first fish and harvesting our first deer, the sports we played, the trouble we got into, when we learned to drive a car, graduating from high school, meeting our spouse, what it was like to date, getting married, the excitement of finding out that you or their parents were pregnant with them, and the child's birth. Maybe as we tell all these stories, we have pictures of these events that we show them to tell them about our life. And slowly, ever so slowly, the child begins to realize that you have this whole life and these whole set of experiences and knowledge that they can't possibly know. And they begin to see that their life is only a small span of time in this whole life you have lived. And then you tell them this: it is absolutely true that you never steal. But I need you to trust me when I tell you it wasn't completely wrong for Aladdin to take the bread and give it to those starving children. I can't explain to you why it's okay and why I'm telling you, and why what I'm telling you about Aladdin seems to contradict what I'm also telling you about not stealing. So I just need you to trust me. That's the conversation God is having with Job. Instead of explaining to Job why he is suffering, God starts by taking Job on a tour of the universe. God shows Job the foundations of the earth and how God carefully measured each and every part. God shows Job the sea and where God set boundaries for it. God shows Job the storehouses of rain and hail and snow that God can loose with a command on this earth. God shows Job the sun and the moon and the stars and how God directs their every course and movement. And then God shows Job a series of wild animals, telling Job that not only did God create every single one of them, that God also knows each and every intimate detail about every one of God's creatures. And God shows Job that every one of these wild, untamed creatures knows God and will do exactly as God commands it. And then God does something else. After God took that pause, as we heard, God invites Job to take his turn. God says to Job, fine. If you can do it better, if you think you can, in your own wisdom and justice, give every single person exactly what they deserve for every single action they take in their lives, then go for it. Give it a try. But let me warn you, God says, it's far more complex than anything you can possibly understand. Because God insists, God does not govern the world by the principle of just compensation. God runs the universe by God's wisdom. It's by wisdom that God has ordered all of creation, and by wisdom that God acts in justice toward every living thing, including humans. The key to understanding the universe is not some straightforward principle like just compensation. The key is God's wisdom. And that wisdom has far greater breadth and depth than we can even begin to fathom. Which leaves us feeling a bit unsatisfied. Because God has not given Job an answer for why he suffers. Job cannot possibly understand the nature of suffering in the world. Like our children with underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes, Job is unable to comprehend the fullness of God's wisdom. He can't grasp the complexity with which God is able to view every single facet of the entire universe. It just isn't possible. So instead of explaining suffering to Job, God invites Job into a relationship of trust. God is inviting Job to trust that no matter what happens, no matter what suffering he experiences in this world, it is governed by God's wisdom. You don't deserve your suffering. Your suffering isn't to keep you from some future sin. Your suffering is not to get you on the right path with God. Your suffering isn't the work of a tyrant who causes suffering for sport. Your suffering is absolutely not your fault. But suffering is a part of the human experience. We all experience suffering in many ways and at many different times in our lives, and we won't understand it. The book of Job invites us to trust God, even in the face of suffering. We're invited to live ever more deeply into a relationship with God, so that through that relationship we might gain a deeper understanding and trust in God's wisdom. Ultimately, the book of Job is about fostering and cultivating a relationship with God, so that even in the depths of suffering and horrible tragedy, we can trust that God has not abandoned us, and that this world, including our suffering, is governed by God's incredible, loving care. Because God's wisdom is grounded in unconditional love and care for every single atom that makes up this whole creation. That's it. Well, it's not actually it. God goes on to rebuke Job's friends, and then he restores to Job double what he had at the start of the story. And the book tells us Job lived another 140 years. He saw 4 generations of his family. And the book of Job ends with these words: "And Job died old and full of days." But the writer makes clear that Job's fortunes are not restored because he endured suffering or because he successfully argued his case against God. Job did not earn or deserve his restoration. The restoration of Job's fortunes is another example for us of God's wisdom governing the universe completely out of God's own free will. Just as Job did not deserve his suffering, he does not deserve his restoration. And just as he cannot understand his suffering, he cannot understand his fortune. All of it, suffering and fortune, are housed within the wisdom of God that is beyond our comprehension. So that's where the book leaves us. an invitation into a deeper relationship with God that places the fullness of our trust in God's providential wisdom in ruling over creation. And as we deepen that relationship and grow in faith and trust in God, we're able to face all of life, the good and the bad, with a sense of peace and calm. We're going to get an example of how that kind of relationship produces this incredible trust and calm in the face of abuse and suffering and death on a cross. We're going to see the wisdom of Job lived out in Jesus' own passion on Good Friday, where he will take suffering and brokenness and sin and even death with him on a cross. And though Jesus will experience personal suffering and betrayal, and he'll even pray to God to find another way to save creation, Jesus will trust in God's unfailing wisdom to bring all things, including human suffering, into the fullness of God's purpose for life and salvation in this world. Thanks be to God. Amen.